When someone with an anxious attachment style begins to heal, the transformation is not loud or dramatic. It's quiet, almost invisible to those on the outside. But on the inside, something powerful is shifting. For a long time, this person may have moved through relationships with a constant need to secure closeness, to check if they were still loved, to reassure themselves that the connection was still intact. They learned to anticipate moods, overanalyze texts, and internalize emotional distance as a signal that they weren't enough. Their identity became wrapped in the pursuit of approval, validation, and emotional consistency, not because they were weak or needy, but because unpredictability in connection made them feel unsafe. Healing, for the anxious, begins the moment they realize that their value isn't proven through how much they try. It starts when they finally stop believing that love is something they have to earn by fixing themselves or pleasing someone else. This is the moment they stop making excuses for inconsistent behavior and start noticing how much they've been bending to fit into someone else's idea of enough. That awareness doesn't come overnight. It builds slowly, often after countless moments of frustration, confusion, and heartache. They begin to see the pattern. The emotional highs of fleeting closeness followed by the crushing lows of distance and silence. And they start asking better questions, not just how do I make them stay, but why do I feel the need to chase someone who doesn't show up fully for me? This shift is subtle at first. Maybe they start responding to that delayed text with indifference instead of panic. Maybe they stop over-explaining themselves, stop sending those long messages trying to win back someone's attention. They begin to pause before reacting. They start noticing their own triggers, and instead of feeding them, they meet them with curiosity. Healing brings a kind of clarity that wasn't available before. The realization that love isn't supposed to feel like a job interview where you're constantly waiting to be approved. As this person heals, their energy changes. They stop romanticizing inconsistency and stop confusing emotional unavailability with mystery. What once felt exciting now starts to feel exhausting. They become less interested in being chosen and more interested in choosing themselves. They stop interpreting someone else's emotional withdrawal as a reflection of their own inadequacy. That moment, when they no longer see someone else's silence as their personal failure, is a major turning point. It's not about becoming cold or detached. It's about finally feeling safe within themselves. They stop trying to control the narrative. They stop clinging. They stop over-functioning in a relationship that was never meeting them halfway to begin with. They start to see love differently, not as this desperate need to be wanted, but as a shared space between two emotionally available people who respect each other's needs. They realize that begging for breadcrumbs isn't love, it's survival. And they choose to no longer survive in relationships. They want to thrive. That's when they stop arguing with reality. They accept what someone is showing them instead of holding on to the fantasy of who they could be. They begin to understand that they're not being too much or too sensitive. They just had to learn how to stop outsourcing their self-worth to someone else's inconsistent behavior. In this space of healing, they finally understand that peace feels better than intensity. They don't need the highs and lows anymore. They find power in their silence, in their ability to walk away when their needs aren't being met. They stop fearing loss and start embracing their standards. And perhaps most importantly, they stop seeing love as something to chase and start seeing it as something to receive, but only when it comes with consistency, respect, and emotional safety. The avoidant partner often builds their emotional world on a foundation of distance. Not because they don't want love, but because intimacy feels threatening. Vulnerability makes them feel exposed, and exposure triggers discomfort, fear, or even shame. So they create a dynamic that allows them to stay close enough to keep a connection alive, but far enough to feel safe within their emotional boundaries. This delicate balance requires a certain dance partner, someone who will keep reaching, keep showing up, keep proving their love over and over again. The anxious partner often becomes that person. Their desire for closeness matches perfectly with the avoidant's need to withdraw, creating a loop where one chases and the other pulls away, yet neither fully detaches. In this dynamic, the anxious partner unknowingly becomes the emotional engine of the relationship. They ask the hard questions, initiate the check-ins, express their needs, and often stretch themselves to keep the connection from crumbling. The avoidant doesn't need to invest as much emotionally because the anxious partner is already doing that work for both of them. As long as that effort continues, the avoidant gets to maintain control, emotional distance without complete loss of connection. They can avoid the discomfort of true intimacy while still enjoying the benefits of someone who deeply cares, remains available, and continually works to stay connected. It creates a false sense of balance, one that feels comfortable to the avoidant but emotionally taxing for the anxious. What the avoidant often doesn't realize is that their ability to stay distant is entirely dependent on the anxious partner's willingness to stay engaged. The moment that energy shifts, the balance begins to unravel. When the anxious person starts to heal, when they stop chasing, stop over-functioning, stop trying to fix everything, the avoidant is left with a vacuum. The emotional labor that once kept the connection alive has been removed, and they're no longer being held in place by someone else's effort. The silence, which once felt like a strategy to maintain control, suddenly feels unfamiliar. The avoidant may begin to wonder why the other person isn't reaching out like they used to, why the tension is gone, why the emotional pressure has been lifted. But with that release comes something they didn't anticipate: emptiness. Without the anxious partner's emotional anchoring, the avoidant is left to confront their own role in the relationship. For perhaps the first time, they're exposed to the reality that closeness isn't just about managing someone else's needs. It also requires meeting those needs. And without the anxious partner constantly filling in the emotional gaps, the avoidant begins to feel the absence, not just of the person, but of the dynamic they had come to rely on. They may not have realized how much they depended on the reassurance, the consistent effort, the emotional grounding that the anxious partner provided, because it wasn't obvious. It came through little things, through texts sent first, questions asked, forgiveness offered quickly, space held for feelings that weren't mutual. Now that all of that is gone, the avoidant is left with a mirror they can no longer turn away from. This loss doesn't register in obvious ways. It creeps in through silence, through moments when they check their phone expecting something that never arrives, through the growing awareness that the dynamic they once managed so carefully no longer exists. The avoidant begins to feel something they often work hard to avoid: emotional responsibility. Not necessarily guilt, not immediately regret, but an unsettling sense that something is missing. And not because it was taken from them, but because they never fully stepped into it. They may try to convince themselves that they're better off, that freedom feels good, that distance is what they always wanted. But deep down, there's a growing awareness that freedom without connection feels more like isolation, that the constant reassurance they once labeled as too much was the very thing that kept them emotionally tethered. The structure the avoidant built to protect themselves only works when someone else keeps showing up to knock on the door. Without that, it starts to collapse in on itself. The anxious partner's healing removes the emotional scaffolding the avoidant unknowingly leaned on. Suddenly, all the space they once craved feels colder, quieter, less certain. The balance has shifted, not because the avoidant changed, but because the anxious did. And in doing so, they disrupted a dynamic the avoidant never thought would end. There's something revealing about silence, something about space that forces clarity in a way constant presence never can. When someone with an anxious attachment begins to heal and finally stops filling in all the gaps in a relationship, the emptiness they leave behind doesn't just sit there, it echoes. It highlights what was once hidden beneath their consistent effort, and it brings to the surface everything that was being avoided under the weight of their emotional labor. For the avoidant partner, that space becomes unsettling, because as long as the anxious person was showing up, reaching out, initiating conversation, and trying to maintain closeness, there was no pressure to reflect, no need to confront what was missing in their own behavior. But once the anxious stops doing that, everything changes. Suddenly, the energy that once flooded the relationship is gone. The check-ins stop. The just thinking of you texts don't arrive. The emotional temperature cools, and for the first time, the avoidant is alone with their own presence in the relationship. And that absence begins to illuminate what the anxious person was carrying all along. Their need for reassurance, their constant effort, their fear of being abandoned. It wasn't a burden to the avoidant, it was a buffer. A way to keep emotional responsibility at bay while still maintaining connection. It allowed the avoidant to stay emotionally distant without facing the consequences of that distance. But now, with no one reaching across the emotional divide, that protective wall doesn't feel like safety, it feels like isolation. The presence of the anxious partner used to absorb the discomfort. Their effort kept the relationship emotionally alive. Even when they were in pain, even when they felt unseen or unappreciated, they continued to show up. That showing up gave the avoidant the illusion of control, like they could keep intimacy at arm's length while still benefiting from its warmth. But with that effort gone, what's left is a kind of emotional stillness that makes it impossible to hide. Without the anxious partner reflecting emotional energy back at them, the avoidant starts to notice the silence in ways they never had to before, and that silence begins to confront them. Where there was once someone asking questions, now there are none. Where there was once reassurance offered without being asked, now there's quiet. The avoidance of vulnerability, which once felt like a strength, now exposes the absence of depth in the connection. And the avoidant may find themselves questioning why it feels different now, why the relationship, or the lack of it, suddenly feels heavier, more noticeable, more real. That's what space does. It takes away the distractions, it removes the noise, and in doing so, it reveals what's truly there, or what never was. For the avoidant, that realization doesn't come with dramatic emotion. It's subtle. It's in the small moments, the pause before they reach for their phone and realize there's nothing to check, the quiet nights that feel a little too quiet, the absence of that familiar presence, not just physically, but emotionally. And it stirs something unfamiliar, not because they suddenly want to change, but because they're beginning to feel the cost of what they never fully participated in. The cost of their distance, the cost of being half present. And that cost only becomes visible when the anxious person steps out of the role they've been performing all along. Space makes things visible. It strips away the layers and exposes what was being hidden by habit, fear, or avoidance. And for the avoidant partner, what space reveals is that the relationship was never balanced, that someone was carrying more than their share, emotionally speaking, that the connection they thought they had wasn't sustainable without the effort of the person they kept at a distance. It's not always regret that shows up first, it's awareness, a sense that something important was lost, not in a dramatic ending, but in a quiet withdrawal of energy. And that energy wasn't just love, it was effort, vulnerability, care. All the things the avoidant thought they didn't need until they were gone. This kind of revelation doesn't come from confrontation. It doesn't come from arguments or ultimatums. It comes from space, from the absence of the emotional current that once made everything feel okay, even when it wasn't. And once that current is gone, the avoidant is left to sit in what's real, not what they were avoiding, not what they were rationalizing, but what's actually left when the performance ends. That's the moment space begins to do its work, not to punish, but to reveal, not to manipulate, but to clarify. And in that clarity, everything starts to look different. It's not the end of the relationship that shakes the avoidant. It's the silence that follows the end. When the anxious partner finally stops reaching out, stops checking in, stops trying to fix or revive the connection, that's when the absence begins to register. For a long time, the avoidant has learned to cope with discomfort by creating space. They withdraw when things get too intense, shut down when conflict arises, and retreat into themselves when emotions feel too overwhelming. This becomes their pattern, a way to feel in control. And while it may not be malicious, it does create a dynamic where they rely on the other person to keep things going. Especially when that other person has anxious tendencies. There's often an unspoken dependence on their need to repair, reconnect, and keep the bond alive no matter what. The anxious partner, because of their attachment style, often carries the emotional burden in the relationship. They feel the tension first, they chase reassurance, they try to bridge the distance. And the avoidant gets used to this rhythm. It becomes familiar. The anxious partner reaches, the avoidant pulls away, but somehow the anxious always comes back. That return is expected. It gives the avoidant a sense of comfort, not necessarily in closeness, but in knowing they won't be fully left. As long as the anxious partner keeps reaching out, the avoidant can avoid dealing with their own emotional responsibility. They don't have to initiate, to engage deeply, or to confront what they might lose, because the loss never fully materializes. The anxious partner's persistence softens the blow every time, but healing shifts this cycle. When the anxious person begins to truly heal, they stop trying to repair what isn't reciprocated. They stop filling the silence, stop making excuses, stop shrinking themselves to be accepted. They begin to see the dynamic for what it is, not a sign that they are unworthy of love, but a pattern that no longer serves them, and they choose to break it, not by making a dramatic exit, but by doing something far more powerful. They go quiet. They stop chasing. They stop explaining. They stop pouring energy into a relationship that continues to pull away. That quietness isn't a tactic. It's a reflection of their growth. They no longer need the avoidant to understand their worth. They've begun to understand it for themselves. And that's the moment the avoidant starts to feel something different, not immediately. At first, they might believe that the space is just more of what they're used to. They may think the anxious partner will return again, like they always have. They tell themselves this is temporary, that the cycle will repeat. But as days turn into weeks, and there's no message, no apology, no attempt to reconnect, the avoidant begins to notice the shift. Something is different this time. The familiar pattern is broken. The silence isn't part of the dance, it's the absence of the dance altogether. What unsettles the avoidant isn't just that the anxious person is gone, it's that they no longer feel needed. That neediness, though often criticized, was a form of connection. It gave the avoidant something to respond to, something to resist, even something to control. But now, with nothing to push against, they're left alone with their own emotional world. And in that stillness, they start to feel the absence not just of a person, but of a role they had grown used to. They may not miss the closeness. They may not even know how to identify what they're feeling, but they start to sense that something valuable has slipped through their fingers, not because it was taken, but because they never held it properly to begin with. The anxious partner's silence becomes a mirror. It reflects back the emotional unavailability that was never addressed. It shows what happens when one person stops compensating for what the other refuses to give. And for the avoidant, that mirror is not easy to look into. It brings up feelings they've worked hard to suppress: regret, confusion, vulnerability. They may try to rationalize it, to dismiss it, to move on quickly. But the echo of that silence follows them. It lingers in the background of new connections. It makes them wonder, even if they don't say it out loud, why the person who used to care so much no longer does. Why the door that was always open is now closed. Why the comfort of being chased has vanished. It's not the breakup that hits the avoidant, it's the realization that no one is coming back, that the anxious partner has finally stopped reaching, that the emotional safety net they once took for granted is no longer there. And in that realization, they are left to confront the space they helped create but never thought they'd have to live in alone. Detachment changes everything. For the person with an anxious attachment style, detachment isn't a moment, it's a process. It doesn't begin with anger or resentment, it begins with exhaustion. It starts when they wake up one day and realize they're tired of feeling like they're the only one trying, tired of interpreting mixed signals, tired of holding on to hope that someone emotionally unavailable will suddenly show up in a different way. What once felt like love starts to feel like anxiety. The thrill of chasing closeness turns into a deep, internal fatigue. And in that exhaustion, a quiet decision forms. Not to hate, not to punish, but to let go. Not because they no longer care, but because they finally do, about themselves. This kind of detachment isn't the cold, hardened withdrawal of someone playing games. It's the gentle but firm removal of emotional investment from a place that no longer feels safe. The anxious partner, for so long, has been the one to accommodate, to bend, to explain, to make excuses, to hang on to any sign of interest like it's proof that the relationship still has potential. But something shifts when they begin to realize that love without consistency isn't love. It's confusion. They start seeing the difference between chemistry and compatibility, between someone who says they care and someone who actually shows up when it matters. And slowly, they stop needing the crumbs. They stop craving validation from someone who struggles to give it. The need doesn't vanish overnight, but it softens. And with that softening, clarity begins to take its place. Detachment is power reclaimed. It's not about becoming indifferent or emotionally unavailable. It's about no longer feeling tethered to someone else's inconsistency. The anxious person starts listening to their own intuition, their own feelings, their own needs. And more importantly, they begin to act on them. They stop rationalizing behavior that leaves them feeling small. They stop blaming themselves for someone else's lack of communication or vulnerability. They understand that they are not too much. They were just with someone who couldn't meet them in their emotional depth. That realization doesn't come with bitterness, it comes with peace. Peace that doesn't scream or announce itself, but makes itself known in small, powerful ways. In the decision not to reply, in the strength it takes to walk away, in the silence that replaces the once compulsive need to reach out. What happens in that moment is not just an internal shift, it triggers something in the avoidant partner too. The dynamic they had grown accustomed to, the one where they were pursued, where space was always met with closeness, is disrupted. And they begin to feel the weight of what they had, often for the first time. Because when someone is always there, it's easy to overlook their value. It's easy to take consistency for granted when you've never had to earn it. The avoidant may have felt in control, believing that emotional distance protected them, that not needing anyone kept them safe. But when the anxious person detaches, that illusion cracks. Suddenly, the space they relied on feels empty. Not peaceful, not liberating, just empty. This is when the avoidant begins to feel the loss, not in the presence of conflict, but in the absence of energy, in the stillness where there used to be motion. They start remembering not just the anxious person's flaws, but their presence, their care, their effort, their willingness to try again and again. And without that presence, there is no longer a buffer between the avoidant and their own emotions. There is only the reality of what they let slip away. They may reach out, they may test the waters, but it's different now. The anxious person is no longer emotionally available in the same way. They're not waiting, they're not hoping, they're moving forward. This shift in power isn't about winning. It's not about making someone regret their choices. It's about no longer needing someone else to choose you in order for you to feel chosen. The anxious person doesn't detach to teach a lesson. They detach because their healing no longer allows them to stay in environments where they feel emotionally neglected. They've stopped seeing their role as the fixer. They've stopped confusing love with proving themselves, and that is where the real transformation happens, in the quiet confidence of someone who has finally remembered who they are and what they deserve, in the calm after the storm, in the peace of no longer fighting for someone who never fought back.